I'm Connor Old and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1972 class of films, a film that is maybe the least known in all of my filmography. I'm talking about 1972's Sounder. So, if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture, starting with the year 1988 and working backwards, that I believe has been either forgotten or I've never heard of, or if maybe heard only a little bit about it. And I talk about, at the time this was considered, at least by the Oscars, one of the top 5 films of all time. Yet in some scenarios I haven't even heard of the film, like in this one. So I wanted to explore sort of the Oscar history at the time, try to figure out why, maybe it was forgotten or why it is talked about. I'm going to give some of my thoughts about the film, but I also sort of try to answer the question, why doesn't it hold up, as well as giving some of the Oscar history, like I said. And in 1972, the Oscars was a very unique year, because arguably this is the winner of Best Picture was the best picture winner of all time, because some people think it's the best movie of all time. I'm talking about The Godfather. So of course I didn't cover The Godfather because it's a classic, one of the greatest movies of all time. At least I think so. And it is notable that this was actually a bit of a surprise win. The other sort of the two movies that were sort of competing for Best Picture was Cabaret, another nomination, which ended up with 8 Oscars to Godfather's only 3. And a lot of times that we see in the Oscar history, it's obviously less of a relationship today, but there's a huge relationship between Best Director and Best Picture. They almost always tied up. And going into the Oscars, The Godfather was this huge, massive critical success, but also this commercial success. It was a massive film. I think it was one of the highest grossing films of all time when it came out. It's still high up on that list. Really a cultural phenomenon. So as such, sort of the early precursors, the Golden Globes, the National Board of Review, started to the DGA started to give Godfather these awards. So going into the Oscars, it seemed like Best Picture would go to The Godfather. So in that sense, it wasn't surprising. But as the Oscars started to come along, we started seeing Cabaret win a lot of these technical awards. And then it wins Best Director for Bob Fosse. So in that case, you're watching the Oscars, you think, Cabaret, I think, has 8 now to Godfather's 1 or 2. Of course, Cabaret is going to win. And then sort of Godfather pulled a sort of a Moonlight, if you compare that to La La Land, sort of a bit of a surprise upset, winning Best Picture without that Best Director, but still getting Best, I guess it was Best Lead Actor for Marlon Brando, and then Best Writing for Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola. So that was sort of a surprise win, but I didn't want to cover Cabaret or Godfather, because I think they're classics in their own right. Cabaret is a great musical if you haven't seen it and won a bunch of Oscars. Another nominated film was Deliverance. This is sort of a Southern classic, as you would say, very typical and sort of resonant of its time, starring Burt Reynolds, who passed away recently. I think it's not so recently now, but last year, I believe. But I think that's the one that's sort of famous, especially when he died. That was sort of one of his defining legacy films, from John Boorman, director of Excalibur, things like that. It was a movie I've definitely heard of. The banjo scene, sort of a classic scene. So I didn't want to cover that because I think there was other options. So it really came down to The Immigrants and Sounder, the last 2 nominations. And now, from what I know about The Immigrants, I know it's directed by Jan Troll, and this is actually paired with The New Land, the sort of sequel to The Immigrants, released the next year, and now it's actually bundled in a Criterion, and that's the only reason I know about this film. But this is sort of a long 3.5-hour film. I think the sequel's in sort of 3 hours as well, and that seems sort of like, as they package it together, Jan sort of sees it as a part 1 and a part 2. They're bundled together, sort of this one long epic journey of coming to the States and then sort of living here from sort of a Swedish perspective. I think that if I were to cover Immigrants, even though I was interested in seeing it, Criterion has some sort of badge of quality, I guess you would say. I was still hesitant because I knew I was only covering half of sort of this journey that the filmmaker intended. So really, it came down to Sounder, which actually fit the bill really well. Going back, I'm on Letterboxd, if you don't know, which is sort of a movie recording app. You can log, write reviews, things like that. On that app, I always record all my movies, and of all of them, I think this one is I think it's the second or third least seen, but it's like the first most reviewed. It has like 53 reviews. It's only 1,000 people have seen it, at least logged it on Letterboxd, which is kind of strange. Just for reference, A Touch of Class, I think, was the other lowest with the 666 people saw that movie, funny enough. But this was an interesting one because Sounder is his Best Picture winner, but yet that's why the series exists, because in a lot of ways it has been forgotten. Really, when I look at it, sometimes I go, oh, I haven't recognized the director, or I haven't recognized the stars. In this case, it was a little different, actually, because I did sort of recognize the director, Martin Rett. I definitely knew of his name. I didn't really know what films he made, but I knew he was a director and a well-respected director. If you don't know, he's made movies like The Long Hot Summer and HUD, and The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and Norma Rae, which was an Oscar film that we almost covered. But I wanted to cover him here. Then the two leads, Cicely Tyson and Paul Winfield, they're not necessarily these huge stars, but they haven't disappeared necessarily either. They have Paul Winfield, for example, is I think a household name. I recognized him, and I'd seen his movies before. And Cicely Tyson has sort of just been sort of a great supporting actress, as my sort of understanding of her, and I sort of always respect her as an actress. So it wasn't a situation I just didn't know them, but for some reason I just didn't know the film. Maybe I should have. My sort of explanation as to why I haven't heard, I guess, trying to figure out, is that it has sort of been underrated. You look at underrated Oscar movies, and this always pops up because for some reason just people don't talk about it. It's kind of a hard recommend. We'll talk about maybe why that doesn't hold up a little bit later. But I do notice that as my sort of looking back on film, that relationship, as we go sort of more into the past, my knowledge starts dwindling, especially we go into the 60s in a couple weeks. Heck, that's why I did an old on old series, because I'm still trying to understand the classics and trying to understand sort of this time period, because I think, like everyone, they're very good at their modern time, but then they're trying to understand previous things. But I think that's what gives the show sort of a unique edge, because I give it from a 20-year-old's perspective. Nonetheless, it's transitioning into my thoughts. I actually really like the movie, but it's a very sort of particular type of movie, and I'm not sure. Some movies I really like and I really recommend. This one is maybe a hard recommend, and I think that's part of the reason why it doesn't hold up, because definitely as we go into the 70s and we'll be into the 60s, the pace of these films really are a certain sort of style, especially nowadays. The movies are just much faster edited because it's digital technology, and it doesn't cost as much money, it doesn't cost as much time. I feel like there's more use of music. There are some sort of slower movies and deliberate, but even then there's still things happening. There are sort of a certain rhythm and pace to each sort of generation of films, and the 70s have a very unique pace, and that works for something like The Godfather, when it's a 3-hour-long movie and you're really into it. But for this movie, for 2 hours, it is sort of hard to get into this sort of world and try to, just understand and try to get what's going on in the story. I think that's sort of a fault of it, is that it doesn't really draw you in very early on. But you do have to recognize going to these movies that does have sort of a different kind of pacing. You have to understand that this is an older movie. You have to treat it with a little bit more patience. That being said, there's certain aspects I really enjoyed about it that I think elevate it for me. Largely, it's just that sort of familial bond to the movie. It is kind of a family movie, but to be saying that would almost be undermining and demeaning, because it's not just a family movie. It's just because it's well realized. It's not something that's very pandering that many family films, I think, tend to be. It really understands sort of the family dynamic, but doesn't do it in sort of a funny games kind of dark aspect to it, I guess you would say. And that's why I really enjoyed about it. I think the performances from the entire cast, especially the kid actors who are so hard to find, are really fantastic. And it's just that dynamic. There's so many great lines in here. Of course, I'm adapted from an acclaimed novel, so I'm sure those were taken straight from the novel, but there's some really great lines here, and they understand the relationship between the father and the son, and the husband and the wife. They understand that sort of there's an adult respect to the adult and the wife, stuff like that. They're real human beings, and they can fight. You can tell that they're human beings, and they're trying to understand. It's almost like a family film from the adult perspective. And then the kids have sort of their own little escapades, going to school, and have a section is completely dedicated to them and this, and they really sort of hold their own, which is hard to find in child actors in the first place. So that was well respected in my regard. And I do have some nitpicks in terms of, I think the film was maybe the camera's not necessarily particularly interesting, I guess you would say. There's many, the shots are there to capture the performances, which they do very well and respectfully, and really emphasize that. But even things like wide shots, or there's just unique settings, I think, oftentimes aren't used. And I think that sometimes there could be maybe a little bit more creativity with the cinematography that I would like to see, especially because we see things like even, Bound for Glory a few weeks ago has amazing cinematography, and we've seen these beautiful sort of Great Depression, even though it's sad, there's a great tragicness by showing some beautiful images, because this period is actually very famous in terms of photography with James G. Agee and things like that. Photographers of the Great Depression era that really captured that time, that I think that maybe it wasn't fully utilized to the extent that I would have enjoyed. But still, I really enjoy the performances and that great familial aspect, and some really beautiful, poignant quotes, I think, throughout the film. But why doesn't it hold up? I guess, that's the central question as to why we're trying to answer. And my sort of theory, I guess, is that this is a family film ultimately. Not necessarily a pandering and sort of that fitting out of that genre, but sort of a Black Stallion-esque family film. But live action family films are actually really hard to keep up and to be relevant. When you're growing up, all the sort of kid movies or family movies that's fun for the whole family kind of thing are animated. And I think in a lot of ways that, because nowadays intellectual property is so valuable in Hollywood, that having a cartoon character that doesn't age and doesn't die and can be recurring and can be in cartoons, it's just so much more useful. So when I was growing up, for example, I'm a big fan of Peter Pan, so I had everything, pirates and Captain Hook on my bib and stuff like that, and that's what I was just sort of ingrained. So when I think about my childhood, not only do I think of watching Peter Pan and loving that movie and Hook, for example, but I also really connected to these characters because they were more than just the movies, because they were on my clothing and they were on my posters in my room, that sort of thing. So it is sort of more of that. So I think nowadays, the family film, they're very good for their time. I think of successes recently like Wonder and Instant Family, two really big successes that were well critically acclaimed, and people like them, and they're both family films. But I don't think they're necessarily going to be remembered unless they're shown down to you from your parents, for example, because they don't inspire a lot of, they're not sort of an ordinary people, which completely tries to dissect the family dynamic. They are sort of a reserved nature to it, and maybe that doesn't get the respect from the sort of film criticism community, because they're good, but there's not a lot to get them in terms of essays and talk about them. So unless they're sort of talked about throughout your family and passed down, live action family films just don't really hold up and to the long legacy of films. And really it's these animated films that are family films as well, because they can be commercialized and used as intellectual property and always brought back years later. Look at The Lion King, look at Aladdin, they're live action remaking of these animated characters, but guess what? You're still going to see that Blue Genie 20 years from now, but I'm not sure if you're going to see the Will Smith version of the Blue Genie. That being said, that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Make sure to comment below. Let me know your favorite movie of 1972. Would you have given it Cabaret or maybe The Godfather? Is The Godfather the best picture of movie of all time? I think it is. What do you guys think in the comments down below? I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Give me some suggestions for next week, which is 1971. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.